Welcome to the day after the night before that never seemed to end. But finally, we have a result from Canada's federal election. The next government will be a minority Liberal government led by Prime Minister Mark Carney. That's an incredible comeback for a party that was left for dead at the holidays, but it's also not the result that many polls were suggesting. So what exactly have we learned after a long night of tabulating votes across the country? Well, several things. For starters, our democracy, our system of governance, it worked. Elections Canada, for whatever we might think about them, did a marvelous job making sure we had a free, fair, and transparent election. The results, they're not being challenged by anybody, subject to maybe a few judicial recounts where ridings were extremely close in vote counts to make sure those results are accurate, but on a whole, no one is disputing who won this election or what the overall structure of the next parliament will be. That can't be said in every country around the world. Even in democracies we've long held up as bastions of the free world. So Canada, good job. Beyond that, of course, is that the vote totals were not quite what the polls were suggesting. They were pretty close. Pollsters weren't wildly off, but they did undervalue the Conservative vote. So even though the Conservatives blew a 25-point lead at one point, or 24 to be exact, they did better than the polls were suggesting in the weeks leading up to this race. In part, that might be a reaction to the tragic events Saturday night that brought crime and safety issue to the forefront of some voter minds. But I think the bigger issue is you, young voters. Not now, I realize most of you can't vote yet, but according to Civics, who is a nonprofit organization that runs Student Vote Canada that many of you participated in, would have actually voted for the Conservative Party. And indeed, those who do have a ballot, those in the 18 to 25 or 35-year-old range, heavily sided with the Conservative Party of Canada. That means, in many ways, pollsters undervalued your representation at the polls. They undervalued your ability to actually show up and vote for a party. Historically, your demographic hasn't been so good at that. I get it, I've been there. But the reality is you did show up and heavily did back the Conservatives. That's a new trend line in politics. Even old Winston Churchill used to say, if you're young and conservative, you have no heart, and if you're old and you're liberal, you have no brain. Well, in this election, it was the invert of that. Young people voted Conservative, older people tended to vote for the Liberals. Of course, I'm generalizing a bit, but those are trend lines. And what it's doing is, as we talked about last night, is mixing up our political ideological spectrum. Rather than the traditional left-right axis, increasingly what we're seeing is a fight between populism and globalism. And though globalism as a whole across society isn't exactly doing very well, it's not sort of seen in a positive light in many corners of the world, which is why we've seen these so-called change elections happening in Europe and certainly in the United States. What we did see in Canada is that globalism isn't quite dead yet, because Mark Carney, he's most certainly a globalist. And he did form government with a percentage of the vote that was higher than most Liberal governments have received in numerous elections, and even in previous elections where they had a majority government. In this case, of course, it will be a minority. They have the most seats in Parliament, but not the majority of seats in Parliament. That means they will have to find ways to work with opposition parties, including a more robust Conservative Party, but also, of course, the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party. Now, we'll get to each of those scenarios in a second, but back to the ideological change-up, because what we are seeing here is that Pierre Poilievre succeeded by rallying young voices who are increasingly bracing populist policies because they're fearful for their future, particularly around cost of living issues. Now, we can get into populism at a later date as whether it's a positive or a negative, but the reality is the Conservative Party is morphing to not only embrace right-wing policies, but also steal votes from the traditional blue-collar working class that traditionally had been the base of the NDP party. That's the coalition that led Pierre Poilievre within a few centimeters of forming government himself. But alas, he came up short. Mark Carney and the Liberal Party found a way to hold on to many of the urban centres, but also lost ground while gaining ground in some non-traditional ridings. They cobbled together a coalition, again, of older voters, not necessarily their traditional base, and certainly voters who embrace that idea of globalism. So again, we're seeing this new dynamic play out in Canada, and that's something to watch going forward. We talked about this a bit last night, the spectre of separatism. In Alberta, it's alive and well, and in Saskatchewan as well. That's an issue going forward for the Prime Minister, but also for the Leader of the Opposition, because the Conservative Party has to be careful in a time of crisis not to push too heavily in fighting for things that could basically break our nation apart. On the same token, while separatism is clearly in decline in Quebec, it doesn't mean that it's spent force. The Bloc Québécois lost about a third of their seats in the House of Commons, but they're still going to hold a significant portion of the balance of power. Now, last night, for a period of time, it looked like they would hold the balance of power, the deciding votes that would determine if a government could stay in power or not in a minority context. Right now, though, it appears, pending a few judicial recounts, as we discussed, that it will be the NDP who will probably still hold that balance of power to keep the Liberals in a minority government power structure. So the Bloc don't hold that balance of power, but they're still robust in terms of their seat total. They'll be the third largest party in our next parliament. And of course, as we discussed, the Parti Québécois rather, is poised to form government in Quebec in the next provincial election in that province. And that means that we should probably not believe or lull ourselves into a sense of complacency that Quebec separatism is gone forever. It's not. It's just dormant for the time being, given the current issues. So Canada is facing a national unity crisis on two fronts, and that's something that this election has demonstrated is a clear and present danger for all leaders to pay attention to in a real way. More than that, though, what we saw is a divided nation. It was increasingly becoming a two-party system, like we see, of course, in the United States and in other countries around the world, where the Liberals and the Conservatives are eating up more and more of the total vote share. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it probably depends on your worldview, but it is increasingly a reality. That being said, as we talked about, the Bloc Québécois isn't dead, and the NDP, though they lost official party status, that important designation that gives them money and power and resources in the next parliament, they're also not dead as a party themselves. They still have tremendous power. After all, they form the government in a couple of provinces in this country, and they hold the official opposition status in other provinces as well. That means the NDP may have been wiped off the map in this election, but it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be wiped off in future elections. So that's something else to watch. Can they rebuild, or do we increasingly move into this two-party structure? And what role does the Bloc play in that kind of system? And could an Alberta Separatist Party rise up and be a counterbalance to that in the West? These are all questions that need to be answered. But the one question that we do have answered is the overall vote total. Almost 70% of Canadians turned up at the polls. That's a huge turnout. Not a record by any stretch, but it's a massive turnout that shows you the importance Canadians valued this election at this important juncture in our nation's history. On top of that, every vote that was cast mattered. Now, we can all debate the value of votes and ridings that seem to be a foregone conclusion, but the reality is winning the popular vote is a moral victory. It does matter. It gives you a sense of authenticness and credibility in the way that you govern. The past couple of elections, the government that formed power, Justin Trudeau's Liberals, lost the popular vote but won the most seats. They had an efficient vote, as it's known as. Data analytics, basically, like you see in baseball or hockey. Now, that led to a lot of ill will, a feeling that their government wasn't totally credible because they didn't have the backing of the majority of all Canadians. So this time, Mark Carney got that majority, not in the seat count, but in the popular vote. So every vote counted in that sense. The other way, of course, is in individual ridings. This election was incredibly close. It came down to a handful of ridings in every region of this country, including Nunavut, Newfoundland, BC, places that often aren't seen to be having a big say in that final makeup of Parliament, but they did this time. And in some cases, those ridings turned on a dozen votes. That means every single individual vote counted, which should always be a lesson to you that no matter where you live, your vote matters. So always show up and cast it, whether your party wins or not, whether you think they have a chance or not. Because even when the polls tell you it's not true, as we saw last night, anything is possible. So those are the big takeaways, I think, from this election. But of course, the big challenge is ahead for all parties in this next parliament to find ways to work together, to bridge divides we see increasingly creeping up across this country. Whether it's East versus West, French versus English, North versus South, Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, environment versus the economy, and of course, how do we tackle all those pieces together and then work on the big challenges we face in terms of the threats posed by US President Donald Trump, his trade war, and his threats to annex our nation. All of that has to be addressed while simultaneously finding ways to grow and sustain our economy, find ways to protect our environment, and of course, address the multitude of other issues that matter to Canadians, like the cost of living issues and social justice and reconciliation in other corners of the country. So all of these are major issues. It's a Molotov cocktail in many ways of problems, and it's not going to be an easy task for Prime Minister Carney or even for opposition leader Pierre Poilievre. How this all plays out remains to be seen, but we have to remember, democracy isn't just election day. Democracy is every single day. We need to understand how it works. We need to participate in every facet of our democratic conversations, not just at the ballot booth, but in the debates we have with one another, how we engage government, how we help them enhance their policies, and how we find ways to better our country for people, for nature, for all.